Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Hector Del Castillo and I want to welcome you to today's BoldPM Insights webcast. Today's topic is 5 prescriptions for attracting, engaging, and converting your webinar audience. And today's speaker is Mike Agron. You can log in using VoIP or you can actually use the numbers shown in your screen to hear the audio. And also I wanted to point out that we will have a Q&A portion and we will go through and be able to discuss and take your questions at the end of today's discussion. I also would like to give a special thanks to Webinar Ready for getting us the topic, today's content, and today's speaker as well. I also want to thank Launch Podcast and Launch Workplaces for their support in this ongoing series. If you're on Twitter, I would like to ask if you can use hashtag Business Intelligence and also use the following Twitter handles, Webinar Ready and my own, HM Del Castillo, if you want to tweet and share today's information. We're also going to have some giveaways and you must be present to win. We will give away an electronic copy of the Essential Kit for Marketeers from the Content Marketing Institute. And as a special bonus, Mike at WebAttract has agreed to provide a copy of his ebook, which is Webinar Ready. And there's lots of information if you are looking to host successful webinars. And we'll be giving these away at the end of today's session. I also want to point out that we have some handouts that you can feel free to download now. And the handouts will be a summary of today's discussion, as well as handouts from Webinar Ready WebAttract. And there's also an online course that that WebAttract is gracious enough to provide us a promo code. If you're interested in registering and getting a 10% discount on registration, use the code at the bottom of this slide to register by July 1st and get a 10% discount on their online course, which goes into a lot more detail regarding how to produce your own webinars. Some housekeeping items. I mentioned earlier that we are going to have a Q&A portion, and you can submit your questions throughout using the questions box, and we will have also a couple of polls that the speaker will do later today, and you can actually respond to those. We would appreciate that you can respond to that during today's discussion, and you'll see a poll at the beginning and also towards the end of today's discussion. And also, before you leave today, make sure to fill out the post-webinar survey. We would like to get your comments and figure out what are the things that we need to do to continue to improve this webcast series. And we will also have the slides available, and we'll have a follow-up email where you get information as a link where you can actually view the entire slide deck of today's presentation. So in the audience today, here's a breakdown of representative of the sectors that are part of the audience today based on your responses. So without further ado, I'd like to talk about today's topic. Today, more than ever, attendees are looking for information and they're looking to get educated and become more informed about decisions of what they're offering, and clients are looking for information regarding what's the value of offerings from different vendors. A well-executed webinar can help executives and managers go beyond just sound bites to tell a great story with demonstrable business outcomes for both your prospects and existing customers. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Mike, and Mike is the executive webinar producer for WebAttract. He co-founded this company in 2008. He's also an award-winning author, coach, and frequent guest speaker on webinar demand generation best practices for the American Marketing Institute, the Content Marketing Institute, and also other organizations. After 25 years in high-tech sales and business development and global alliances with firms such as Apple, Oracle, and MapInfo, he's harvested his experience to creatively help clients use webinars to reach new markets. And he looks at webinars as a mini theatrical event, like a radio show with pictures. and he's got front row seats to every participant in the audience, and he uses this technique to actually target and uniquely focus on providing value to his audience. To learn more about WebAttract, you can go to the website, and also you can contact Mike directly via email, as well as follow him on Twitter. So without further ado, Mike.
Well, thank you so much, Hector, and folks in the audience, thank you so much for joining us today. This is a topic that Hector introduced that's near and dear to us. That's me in the center, obviously, and on the left, that's my actual license plate in California. Very proud to have that because that's what we do as webinars, and we're going to get into that in just a moment. The title today is really 5 prescriptions, and I'll talk in more depth about what each of these are, but these are designed to help you attract, engage, and convert your webinar audience so they can become your customers and future advocates. But what I love about webinars is that it's really a great opportunity, as Hector said, to go beyond sound bites and tell a story with real business outcomes. And again, it's a very theatrical event. And we like to think of a webinar as a radio show, but with pictures. Now, before we go into the actual topics, I'm going to launch a poll so I can learn a little bit more about you. And what I want to know is, the poll will be coming up on your screen. How do you use webinars at your company? And check all that applied. You use them mostly for sales and product demos, customer and partner training, for new sales leads, or what we call demand generation webinars? Or are you investigating using webinars, or you just simply don't do webinars? Go ahead and take a moment to weigh in, and we'd love to see the results of what you have. And I'm going to keep the poll open for just another moment. If you haven't voted, if you just take this moment to go ahead and weigh in, I'll close the polls and then we'll share the results. Well, it looks like just about everybody who has decided to weigh in has. So I'm going to close the, oh, we had one more. I'm going to give it another 5 seconds. There we go. Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much. I'm going to close the poll, and let's share the results, Hector, and see what we come up with. Very interesting. It looks like half of you in the audience aren't even doing webinars. Well, welcome. I really hope that what we cover today is going to inspire you to want to use webinars as part of your marketing toolkit. 17 of you are investigating using webinars, and 17% are using them for demand gen or new sales leads, and the other 17% are using them for partner training. That's fantastic. Okay, so now let's get on with what we want to cover. Today, my focus is going to be on using webinars as a demand generation tactic, getting new sales leads. Regardless if you're trying to raise your brand awareness or promote your thought leadership or drive sales, everything I'm going to be covering is around this. But in spite of the fact that it's focused on demand gen webinars, if you're using them for customer and partner training or for sales and product demos, almost everything I say applies to that. So let's move on. And when we think about demand gen, let's kind of define it. And really, webinars can be used to generate leads by educating your audience and by inspiring them to want to learn more. And that way you can move them from becoming just simply prospects into your advocates and customers. And the theme that we're going to be talking about is attracting the audience, engaging them, and converting them. And that's what my 5 prescriptions are going to cover. But at the end of the day, or at the end of the webinar, the real metric is, did the webinar move the intent to purchase of those in the audience? And this is an actual question that we've used in one of our past webinars, and it was in the post-webinar survey. And we asked them, after attending today's webinar, your plans to purchase or acquire products or services, how did it impact you? And if you notice, 47% said it increased. 24% said they were just researching, but now they intend to acquire. 24% see no need, they were just researching, and 5% said they decreased. So this really hit the nail on the head and created some awareness and interest in the audience, and this is what we want, is to increase their interest in learning more about how you can help them. But what they want is not to be sold. They want to be educated. And the purpose of a webinar that we're going to be talking about is to remember that your attendees are on a journey. Not everybody who signs up or attends your webinar is sales ready to buy now. They're looking to get educated. They're looking to have the opportunity to hear from real thought leaders and to hear real information around a case study or best practices and lessons learned. They want to hear about business value rather than a sales pitch. So even though many of the webinars revolve around the product, we try not to talk about the product. We try not to talk about features and benefits or pricing. Leave that for after the webinar. That's the time to see if there's an interest to continue the sales process. It's not just my word that webinars are effective. In fact, the Content Marketing Institute, if you're not familiar with them, they are an organization out of Cleveland, Ohio that specializes and focuses on using the new way of going to market with content to educate and to make buyers more intelligent. And they do an annual survey, and the survey that they just did showed that the effectiveness of webinars and webcasts is right behind in-person events. It's number 2, where 64% of marketeers find that webinars and webcasts are effective. So are all the other things below it, but it's just to make the point how important webinars really are. Now, we asked you when you registered, what do you want to learn? And this is very important. It's important mainly because we'll probably never meet one another, and we want to get as much information about what your interests are so we can fine-tune and sharpen our presentation to that. So many of you want to know, how do you get started? How do you attract the right audience? How do you tell a story with outcomes? What are some of the key webinar drivers to build leads and sales? And how do you keep the audience engaged? And how do you convert the audience? Well, we're going to cover a lot of these. And as Hector said, I encourage you to download my book. It's free. It's called Webinar Ready, and it is chock full of techniques and information to help you produce and host more effective webinars. So the 5 things that we're going to be talking about today is, how do you choose a topic that's relevant? And then how do you take advantage of industry disruptions and market shifts to tell a great story? And then to go beyond either your house list or to target a particular audience, how do you develop an audience profile that aligns with your value proposition? And then the 4th is, how do you increase engagement with external speakers? And finally, how do you utilize lifecycle intelligence to determine sales readiness? So Hector, before I go ahead, is there anything you wanted to add to this?
I think you've covered actually quite a bit, and I think that it's really key to focus on number 1, which is what you're about to get into, is choosing the relevant topic that attracts your audience, because I think it's really as critical as choosing the right communication channel as to how you're going to distribute the information.
Thank you. And what I want you and the audience to get out of this is to be able to take what you're using now and figure out if there's some best practices in here that you can use to make your webinars even more effective. And those of you that haven't, or that are still investigating webinars or don't do webinars, think about this and how this can help you in getting closer to your prospects so they can become your customers. Well, let's start by setting the stage. And I love this picture because it kind of reminds me of what a webinar or any event can become if it's not properly planned. And that's a goat rodeo. So maybe you can relate to this. If it's not in a webinar you've done, it's another event. It takes a tremendous amount of planning. I'm going to walk you through what's involved. The reason it takes a lot of planning is because it's an ongoing balancing act. If you look at the graphic here, starting on the left, there's business drivers. There's what type of value proposition do you have? What is your messaging? What is your call to action? What kind of success factors do you have? All of this has to be done so you can set the stage. And then there's the ever-changing logistics. When you're working with an event, particularly a webinar, and you have multiple participants from speakers or organizers, it's very important not only to keep everybody up to speed, but to track all the changes. There's a lot of them. And as important is the human factors. And you've got the human factors of your audience. Not all audiences are looking for the same kind of information. You've got human factors in your speakers. What's important to them? How do you keep them motivated? And finally, the technology. And there's an array of technology out there from webinar hosting platforms, whether it's Adobe, GoToWebinar, On24, WebEx, marketing automation such as HubSpot, Marketo, Eloqua. There's a lot of things here that have to be balanced. So these are all the things that have to be balanced along the webinar lifecycle. Now, a question that I often get, and I'm glad I put this in here, particularly for those of you that are investigating webinars, I always get asked, what's the most popular day and time for hosting a B2B webinar? And a B2B webinar is a little bit different than B2C because we're dealing with people in a B2C who are probably working during the day. But for B2B, the best days of the week are Tuesdays, Wednesdays, or Thursdays, usually with start times on the West Coast at 10 a.m. or 11 a.m. And of course, that trees down to 1 p.m. or 2 p.m. on the East Coast. These tend to be the best days of the week for people to want to attend a webinar. But let's kind of begin to demystify how you put a webinar together. How do you navigate the life cycle? I'm going to give you some of those tips here. And you'll see this theme come back and forth as far as a methodology, best practices, and metrics. So to begin to demystify it, let's think of it in what are you trying to do? And the what is attracting an audience, then engaging the audience, and then converting the audience to become your prospect or to become your customer. But you do that, the attract is done before the webinar, the engage is done right now, and the convert is done after. And the way this is all done is by using a set of methodologies, a set of best practices, and using key performance indicators or metrics. I'm going to get into this, and all of this is covered in our book. This is really the framework for executing a webinar. The other question I often get asked is, when should you go live? And I'm going to use the notion that you want to do a webinar and go beyond your house list and recruit an audience that you're not familiar with. And after you've scoped everything out, we like to look at a timeline of 6 to 8 weeks. If you're using your own house list, you can cut that down a little bit. And what's important to factor in is that you should budget at least 1 hour of pre-production time for each live minute. It may sound like a lot, but it's very easy once you get in this thing to see how much time is really involved. From having a kickoff meeting, from developing your invitation, from sourcing the right audience, to doing your message shaping, developing your slides, to doing your daily metric tracking of registration metrics, doing what we call table reads and sound checks and dress rehearsals and going live. And then after the webinar, there's things to do. So all of these things are explained in the book, and in the courses that we teach, we go in, there are 8 hours of modules of online training that goes into depth on these, but I'm just hitting the highlights. So let's start with the first and most important thing, which is choosing a relevant topic. Here's what I want you to know. Webinars done right are really magnets for attracting prospects who really want to become your customers. But here's what you need to remember. They're either like the gentleman on the left who has a lot of questions, he has pain points, that something that's not working well in their business or their operation that's keeping them up at night, or they're actually looking, how can I get better outcomes? How can I get to market faster? How can I reduce cost? Or they're actually like the lady on the right looking for a solution that you have. Those are the two phases they're in. But the thing to remember is they're on a journey to get educated. People are going to buy when they're in pain and they have the money to solve it. So getting back to the relevancy, it's important that your topic and the content is considered a must-have, not a nice-to-have. If it's a nice-to-have, people do not have time or an interest in giving up their valuable day to attend your webinar. But if you've got something that can help them get better outcomes or overcome a pain point, they're going to be interested in attending. Now, what are some of the popular themes that we have seen work to attract, engage, and convert an audience? One of them is a case study. I'll give you some examples of case studies, but case studies are basically an opportunity to review a business challenge, a profile of the organization, what were their options to solving it, what did they implement, what type of business outcomes did they have, did they get to market faster, how much faster, were they able to raise their gross margins, what were the lessons learned, and how do you get started? And this is always something that people are interested in, particularly if they're hearing it from a third party, an external client or partner, rather than yourself. The other is a tutorial, which is a how-to. How do you do something? And finally, one that's extremely popular is anything to do with standards and compliances. So if what your offerings have to do with change in standards or compliance, audiences are very, very interested in learning how does that impact them. So I'm going to give you some examples of some high-performing topics. And these are all webinars that we've done, and some of them I'm going to drill a little bit deeper in. But let's take a look at the first one. This is a small company in the East Coast, and they wanted to talk about a case study on how the world of oil and water separation can have a big impact on how they run their business. The second one was about, for people in the oil and gas industry, why it's important to design and verify safety instrumented systems. The third one was how active rehab protocols reduce post-operative recovery time. That was a tutorial. And as you can see, all of these have a relevance that attracted an audience who wanted to learn something new. So when you download these slides, study these. These are critical in coming up with ideas and topics to attract an audience. And really, there's no shortage of great content sources. There's industry analysts, there's white papers that you have, there's publishers, editors, and authors who could be participating in your webinar. There's success stories from your clients and partners. So there's lots of content out there, and as Hector said in the introduction, it's an opportunity to go beyond the soundbite and breathe life into these particular examples and tell a story. Now, let's move into the second prescription, which really aligns with the first one. This is about using industry disruptions to your advantage. So let's talk about this. I've always found, as long as I've been in the business world, that the more confusion and the more change there is going on creates an opportunity. But the opportunity is, how do you take advantage of that and tell a story that goes beyond sound bites to highlight an innovative solution? And how can you use this to promote your thought leadership? And if you're in a market or an industry that's going through a lot of disruption, as many of those were in the past slide, it's a great opportunity to think about how you can tell a story around that. This is what people really, really want to know. Let me give you the first example. This company I mentioned earlier is called Mercer International, and they're a manufacturer of large systems for industrial facilities to separate oil and water. Their challenge was, how do you educate environmental compliance decision makers with new ways to mitigate disruptions from the potential of injuries, fines, or citations? So they had to educate the market. And what they did is they talked about trends and opportunities. They had an industry expert and an internal speaker, but the industry expert was known for this. And he talked about going beyond the status quo, what you need to do. He also provided an expert case study on the total cost of ownership of oil and water separation. He gave a lot of great examples. None of this is academic or theoretical. It's all real. And he shared with them what are some best practices to retain your compliancy, to avoid fines and citations. And most importantly, not only was the topic delivered, but all of the key deliverables in the invitation were delivered too. And that's an extremely important thing to remember. If you tell the audience you're going to cover 5 things, you need to cover those 5 things, or they'll feel that they didn't get the value that they were intended. So what were the outcomes? We had about 146 people that registered, and this was all beyond their house list. This was not from their house list. 72 or 49% attended, which is a very strong number. Nationally, if you can get 30% of people to attend your webinar, you're doing well. 40% is our benchmark, but 49% showed there was a lot of interest. In the post-webinar survey, 95% said it met, exceeded their expectations. And they did post-sales and nurturing. But here's the payoff. Unbeknownst to them, there was an attendee in the audience who requested an RFP. And what it resulted in is an award to implement their solution in the first U.S. nuclear facility to be built in over 3 decades. It was a high 6-figure sale. This was a small company, not really on the map, but they used a webinar to reach their audience. So let me give you another example. Now that we've talked about a relevant topic and using industry disruptions, what's very important is that you target your message to an audience that aligns with the topic and your value proposition. So the way you do this is you create an audience profile based on your topic and value proposition. Some of the things you want to do is to prioritize which industries will benefit by the topic. What type of people do you want to attend the webinar? So to drill down a little bit, here's 5 key factors or demographics that's important. These start with the industries that you want, the job titles and functions, and I'm going to give you an example of this. What is their job level? Do you want managers, individual contributors, CEOs, directors? What job levels? And what revenue levels? Is that important in your organization that the companies that you're going after? And what geographies are you looking for? This is very, very important because what this is going to do is going to determine the addressable size of the market, and it's going to determine what the availability of contacts are to source. And I'm going to show you the number of contacts you need. But the most important thing, I think, is to really be specific on job titles and functions. For example, if you're looking for engineers, you want to make sure, do you want software engineers or what type of, do you want manufacturing engineers? So that's extremely important. And the example I was going to give, this is a client where we did a webinar about a year ago, and they are a provider of light curable materials. And what they wanted to do is go beyond their typical use cases and typical customers to show them the benefits, the business case for using UV maskings. And so in doing this, what we found was that in zeroing down on the persona, having something like precision in their title really made a difference because this is a precision process. That's just one of many examples that is important to do each step of the way to identify your audience. Now, the question is, if you want to go beyond your house list, how many contacts do you need? And let me explain to you that, as you can see, this is a numbers game. It takes a lot of emails to go out because not everybody is going to be interested or open it. So these are some back of the envelope projections. So if you want to get between 50 to 100 people to attend your webinar, that means you have to have 125 to 250 to register, so you'll get 40%. But the way that works is you're only going to get 1/4 to 1/2 of 1% of the available contacts. And the available contacts we have is 50,000. And again, those contacts match the webinar value proposition. That's where I say it's a numbers game. And when I get into the metrics, it's important to track this, but it works. And you want to look at executing your email marketing campaign 3 weeks before you go live with a measured rhythm of what's called 4 or 5 space drips or touch points. Social media is great, but the big workhorse is email marketing. Now let's go into prescription number 4. And since we're talking about engagement with speakers, I'm going to rehydrate my throat, so give me just a second, and talk about why this is so important. And I guess the question is, who's a thought leader? We hear the term thought leader being bandied around all the time, and really, a thought leader is someone who's an expert, somebody that you seek out for help. So if that's you or if that's somebody else in your organization who's an expert, that's your go-to person. Those are the kind of people that you want to have on your webinar because they're not salesy. They really understand what's going on in their particular space. Having them is critical, and I'll show you why. Here's an example of a webinar we did for DHL, their supply chain group. Here was their challenge. New legislation was coming on the horizon that was going to completely transform the way life services and health business go to market. And what this was about was how you secure the pharma supply chain or your medical devices. And it was all about serialization. And what DHL wanted to do was to get some thought leaders who were real experts in this field that could educate the audience. The goal was to inspire the audience and show them and educate them so they would be interested after the webinar to want to have a sales conversation. Nothing was discussed about the product, about their supply chain, none of that unless it came from both of these individuals, Kent and Lisa, who are not associated with DHL. But here's something else that's as important to remember as everything, and each of you who signed up for today's webinar, we asked you on the landing page, on the registration landing page, what do you want to learn? And as I mentioned a few moments ago, this is so important because we're never going to have an opportunity to find out if what you want to learn is what we're presenting. And it gives us an opportunity to fine-tune our message. The most important thing next to having a relevant topic is an invitation that you hold as sacrosanct because it's really your contract with the audience. And by getting this information, you can uncover new ideas that are timely and relevant to coach your speakers and even your content development to really connect with the audience. So let me give you an example. No need to read all of this, but this is just a snapshot. So we asked people as they registered, what do you want to learn from this webinar? And we asked their job title. So you could see there was a good executive presence of people who attended the webinar. And a lot of the things they wanted to know about were like best practices, trends, how is this going to impact in other markets, so on and so forth. So what we did is we coached the speakers to really define what is the Drug Supply Chain Security Act. And they explained it in such a way that the audience understood why this is important. And then another area is it's a global problem. Counterfeiting, adulteration, tampering, and diversion of products is worldwide. And here's how the U.S. trends impact regulations and product integrity issues in other countries. So we made sure that this was something that was so important that they communicated to their audience. Now let's go to the fifth prescription. And after you have done everything that I've talked about, I mentioned metrics as being one of the pillars of any webinar. And what's important is that you take advantage of tracking these metrics before, during, and after, because what these will do, and I'll give you some ideas, it gives you actionable insights where you can produce a webinar with predictable outcomes that will help you convert your audience. It's uncanny how these metrics work, and I'll give you an example of some of them. Because when the webinar is over, the real work begins. You want to know, okay, how many people are sales ready? How many people are just not a fit? And how many people do we need to nurture? And we need to nurture them with either sending them new, fresh content or emails or whatever it is to keep them in the know. So here's an example of data and intelligence that you can capture. So for example, you know, what kind of industries were represented, what was their areas of interest. This had to do with time capture for attorneys and for different professionals. What state or province were they in? What was their level? How many professionals are in their firm? How did they hear about it? All of these things are very valuable to understand your audience and how to follow up. I mentioned metrics. On email, there are 6 key metrics, and these are so important to track. How many emails were sent? We said 50,000. How many of them bounced? Either bounced because they were invalid addresses or they just couldn't get through. Then how many were delivered? Because knowing how many delivered and how many were sent tells you the quality of your list. How many were open? What is the percentage? How many people clicked on a link? And how many people opted out or unsubscribed and considered it spam? All of these are critical metrics. Again, it's all in our book. A lot of this is also on our website. There's a section on analytics that has videos that goes into more detail. But these are critical email webinar invitation metrics to keep in mind. From a webinar standpoint, these are the 6. Before the webinar, the most important metric and what I call the gold standard is called the click-through ratio, or CTR. This simply measures how many people came to your registration landing page and how many people registered. Now think about it. We've gone through people opening the email, clicking on it. Now, where the rubber hits the road, how many people actually came to your landing page and decided to register or abandon it? That number tells you everything you need to know. If it's 20, 25%, you've got a topic that connects. If it's in the teens, maybe it's your landing page, there's other things. There's just a lot of ways to diagnose how well your message is connecting. But during the webinar, find out what your attendee ratio is. How many of the people who registered actually attended? Are you below 30%? Are you above 40%? What type of engagement do you have during online polls? Online polls are a great way, as you just did, to help weigh in. Let me know what your use cases are for webinars. And how well did you retain your audience? We'd like to see 80% of the audience still online at the start of the Ask the Experts. And then after the webinar, have them fill out an exit survey. And it's okay to do this after the webinar because you've given a lot of information. And I absolutely believe that if you give, it's okay to ask. But don't use this during the webinar to extract information, especially if it feels gratuitous to someone. But after it, how did you like the webinar on a scale of 1 to 5? What could we have done better, so on and so forth. And then the final metric is measuring the on-demand viewings. What on-demand viewings are, you notice we're recording this webinar. So this webinar will be recorded, it will be hosted, and we'll want to know how many people who watched it actually registered for the webinar but didn't attend, how many attended, such as you folks, and wanted to see it again, and how many were fresh new leads. So these are key webinar metrics. And then this information collected, and I'm just giving you a snapshot here, can tell you a lot about the attendee insights. If you look at this chart here from the left, it says your interest. Those acronyms were what was presented during the webinar. Ask them, do they have plans to research this year? Some say not sure, just researching. Some said yes. We asked them what they'd like to learn. How did they rate the webinar? They all gave it a 5. What could be improved? What did you like? What other topics are you interested in? How did you vote in the polls? And did they ask a question? All of these studied give you an opportunity to have a warm follow-up call with a particular attendee, or use this information for your nurturing follow-up. Hector, I bet you when you look, I know when the first time you and I spoke, it was kind of, I think, interesting to you that there's so much valuable information to be used.
Yes, and I was really surprised in how detailed you can get into your indicators that allow you to start really determining who is sales ready and who is not.
Yeah, it's so important because nobody wants to be followed up with if they're not interested, you know?
Yes.
But there's here's an interesting insight. This is back to our friends at Dymax. When we put the original profile together, we came up with about 10 industries. But what we found out was that the industry that was most interested in learning about light curable materials and UV maskings were those in electronics. Aerospace, automotive, precision manufacturing, all these others registered, but this was the biggest area. So this information is actually being used for our second webinar with them to target more towards use cases for people in electronics. So this, again, gives you a lot of insight of who's in the audience to help you with your planning. Another great insight was a recent webinar we did, and we asked the audience, which of the following issues would you list as the most difficult when sourcing auction vehicles? This is by a company that provides software to help automotive dealerships deal with auction vehicles. And what was interesting is that we thought that, or they thought actually, that where it says 18%, the time it takes was the most important driver. It actually was paying the right money. We never could have learned this without conducting an online poll. What they did is they took the value of the webinar beyond just a demand generation exercise and used this to refashion their messaging in their literature, and they completely changed their literature over to reflect it. So it was very, very helpful, insightful information. Again, where else can you get this but from doing a webinar in real time? But here's the real test where the rubber hits the road. And this is an actual poll that we asked. And looking at how the webinar moved their intent to purchase, we asked them, based on today's webinar, which of the following would be of most interest to you? Notice that 32% of the respondents wanted to schedule a demo. What a great call to action. 15% wanted to be contacted. So you have someone raising their hand and say, yeah, I want a demo, I want to be contacted. Yeah, send me the brochure. And some said still considering. That's great. And then we also asked them their plans to purchase or acquire the solution. Look at that, 72% said it increased. 17% said they were just researching but now intend to acquire. 6% just researching but see no need. 5% decrease. Very, very valuable, insightful information. So a couple ways before I summarize and we go to your questions. Webinars impact your demand gen goals more than just closing net new deals. They help you convert prospects into customers. They help you upsell and cross-sell to your existing base. And they help you increase your sales pipeline. But as importantly, it puts you on the map as a viable player. And that's what happened with that Mercer International organization that was out of New Jersey. They were able to attract an audience from across the United States to hear their message. Plus, it also helps you reach new markets and geographies. So my call to action to you for delivering webinars that help you attract, engage, and convert an audience is as follows. Here's some ideas to get started. Take a look in your own organization and identify what kind of market trends, disruptions, challenges are going on that you can use to educate on these opportunities. And then come up with a list of topics, brainstorm with other people in your organization that really are going to demonstrate how to overcome pain points that you would consider to be must-have. And then come up with content that has real demonstrable outcomes that you can tell a story around. Other ideas is to look at going outside of your own organization for speakers that are thought leaders. You want passionate people, and there's no more passionate person to represent you than a client or a partner that's had success. They will love the opportunity to share their success with your audience. And the best thing about it is there's more credibility from them doing it. You don't they basically carry the message. You just have to be there and host it. And again, use metrics before, during, and after to measure and benchmark and predict outcomes. That's a critical part. And I think one of the most important things is this. I said this in the opening about planning. Having a project plan, and it's also laid out in our book, is so important because of all the moving parts in here and all the things that go on. I really believe that if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. So these are some of my ideas to getting started. Now, what I'd like to do is just take a moment and launch my second poll and ask you, based upon what we covered today, which of these 5 prescriptions will most improve your webinar health? Is it choosing a relevant topic? Is it using industry disruptions to your advantage? Is it developing an audience profile to align with your value prop? Go ahead and vote. Or is it increasing engagement using external speakers? Or perhaps utilizing lifecycle intelligence to determine sales readiness? I see a few of you have voted. I'm going to keep the poll open just a little bit longer. Hector, while we're waiting for people to weigh in, what's your thoughts? What do you think? What do you think people are going to choose?
You know, it's really interesting, but I think often it is really about determining your target audience first, and that's where I find most people will struggle because they will say, well, we want to target, you know, certain roles, certain functions within organizations, and often they're struggling in figuring out how to create a persona, a profile of those people that they are going to target. And what I find is that usually they are struggling because they just lack information. Typically, you would get that information when you're going out and looking at creating your user stories and developing the personas based on your offering. And usually that takes some work, a lot of market research, to go out and really create those personas that are not so much fiction based on assumptions from everybody within the organization, but it's really based on facts that are being gathered through market research.
Excellent. Let's take a look. Let's see how people voted. Let's share the results. Let's take a look at our screen. And it looks like the biggest area, well, actually two areas, which I'm delighted to see, is using industry disruptions to your advantage. 2/3 of you voted on that, and utilizing lifecycle intelligence, developing an audience profile, and choosing a relevant topic. Fantastic. Well, thank you. And let me now move off this. And just let you know that if you want to continue the conversation, we love webinars. Think about our thought leadership group on LinkedIn. We've got about 1,200 people in it, where we have other professionals who are blogging and talking about webinars. You can reach me at Webinar Ready. There's a lot of these presentations, and not only on our website, but on SlideShare. I think probably one of the best areas is going to our website. There's a section on there called See Our Work, and you can actually see examples from other clients that we've done on how they used webinars from an array. There's about 12 different industries up there. There's best practice videos. All of this stuff is ungated. You don't have to sign in for anything. There's case studies. There's our blog. And then there's the complimentary ebooks. We're giving one of them today. Also, if you're someone who follows content marketing, I'm going to be speaking for my 4th time at Content Marketing World in Cleveland this September. And so those are some ways to continue. You can always email me. I'd love to talk webinars, and you can even, if you go on my website, you can even sign up for a free 30-minute consultation to talk about your webinar interest. Finally, we're making this available through Hector. If you're interested to become a master webinar producer, and you want to learn all of this stuff and really invest in some skills, highly encourage you to take a look at this. There was a course brochure in there, and we are offering a 10% discount to any attendee if they purchase this course by July 1st.
Yes, well, and Mike, I wanted to point out that actually that code is also available on the handout, the webcast summary handout that is available now. So if you're looking to use that promo code, download the handout, and you should be able to see the link as well as the promotional code if you're interested in registering for this course.
Thanks, Hector. Well, I'm going to turn it back to you. I know we've got quite a few questions. I'm ready.
Great. And once again, I want to remind everybody, if you have not already done so, use the questions box to submit any questions that you have for Mike. And Mike, we do have some questions, and actually there's a question from Karen. And her question is, how do you create influence and excitement on a webinar when the audience may not be viewing your body language? How do you actually translate body language on a webcast through the platform that you're using for a webinar?
Okay, that's a great question. And that's part of the challenge of doing a webinar or any virtual event. Unlike a live in-person event, as you're describing, you don't have the ability to see anybody. You can't see their body language. So the most important thing to remember is the way you do that is make sure that you use the very, very best audio devices possible. I use a professional USB microphone that goes, it's voice over IP. We do lots of sound checks, because if the audience can't hear you, you'll never connect with them. But the second way is to actually gesture, is to smile. You can't see my smile, but I have a smile now. And use your motion of your body. Stand up, move around, as long as you don't get too far away from the microphone. And another technique one of our moderators has is, you know, put a picture of an audience up on your wall in front of you and kind of visualize them. I think the most important thing here is that, you know, your voice is your main instrument to connect with the audience. And the more genuine you can sound, the more authentic and the more excited you can sound, that's the best way to keep your audience engaged while delivering on the promises in your invitation. Thanks. Thank you for that.
That's great. Actually, I want to add something, Mike, to your point, and that is that there are certain platforms like the GoToWebinar that when you have let's say, low number in the audience, you actually have the option of using your webcam, and you can see each other as long as the audience is not exceeding a certain number. That's another way that you can actually start by being able to see each other. It actually also, often you can see a lot of facial expressions that translate into body language when you're using the webcam as part of the platform. I've seen that being used in sales meetings, for example, when you have a handful of people that are attending. And I think it's very effective also that way when you're able to use your webcam to actually start seeing each other as you're discussing and pitching your product or your offering.
Great. Perfect.
I do have another question from Derek, and Derek's question is, what is the best way to leverage a webinar series to nurture leads? Do you focus on topics, or is it, how do you actually start creating that campaign to nurture leads and contacts?
One of the things about a webinar is that if you've done your homework and you have found some topics that are relevant where there's lots of disruption going on, you should think about doing a series. Don't just do one, do a series. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, I have that actual topic on our website if you want to take a look at the webinar. And the reason I say that is because it allows you to make multiple impressions. You create trust with your audience. You become the expert and the thought leader that's helping them on their journey. And one of the best ways to find out about that is in the survey when you ask what other topics would you be interested in. You'd be surprised what people put in there. You might find some trends in there that, this could turn into a series, as well as the attendee insights you get on what people want to learn. See if there's things in there that you can do. And if you do that and you do an ongoing series, you will build that relationship with your prospects, with your clients, to really look to you to become their trusted advisor.
That's great. Great advice. And thank you very much for that answer. And I do have one other question from the audience, and Jeffrey is asking regarding webinar performance improvements, what types of documented results can you share from adopting your approaches in how you conduct webcasts or webinars?
I think a lot of the documentation or examples come from using these metrics and benchmarks. The benchmarks and the metrics that we've used have consistently provided the best results as far as attracting an audience, keeping them engaged, having high attendance ratios, and even their intent to purchase. I've covered some of these on some of these examples, but it really comes from using the data that you collect and how you mine it, because that gives you tremendous insights to know, are you on track? Did you deliver what you promised on? How did your audience react to it? Those are some of the ways to do it, and to certainly look at some of those key metrics: how many people registered, how many people attended, how long did you keep them online, what type of participation did you have or engagement with your polls, the survey, on-demand viewings. Those are all ways that you are able to constantly measure the success of your webinar.
That's great. And I have a question for you, actually, Mike. How, I think it's really critical for product managers to actually really get good at conducting, leading webinars. What are the keys that you believe are to actually start sharpening and improving your skills as a product manager in leading and conducting webinars?
Great question. I think if we go back into looking at what is involved in managing the webinar lifecycle and all the moving parts, it's important to recognize what your core competencies are. And what I mean by that is, are you going to be the executive producer of the webinar, where you're going to be responsible for organizing it and pulling people together, or are you looking to present? probably one of the most important things, regardless of what your role is, and there's so many of them, is to absolutely be confident in your content and your topic, to believe in it, to have passion behind it, to know that you're really going to be sharing information that can help other people achieve their goals and outcomes. That's probably one of the most important things. As far as actually practicing for the webinar, again, there's so many different things that have to be done along the way, but practice is so important, because if people who think build it and they will come, it's not going to happen without a lot of planning. If they think, hey, I'm a great presenter, I'll just show up and wing it. Nope. Doing something like this is very different than anything else, and it's good to practice, not to be scripted so you sound like you're reading, but to be practiced, to be comfortable with the flow and the timing and with your messaging, and make sure that you've allocated enough time, because once you get into it, you may find out that you have more. You may find out you have 10 pounds of jelly beans that need to go in a 5-pound bag. It's not going to work. Figuring that out live, you want to figure that out beforehand. And also understanding that as much as we want to sell and close business and drive revenue, I mean, that's ultimately one of the reasons we're all in business, not all attendees who attend are sales ready to buy now. And so you have to really understand where are they in their journey and work with them. I think those are some of the things, Hector.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And we have other questions, but unfortunately we're out of time, Mike. So I really would like to thank you for this terrific content and topic. And I think you did a great job in covering all the details. And for those of you in the audience, I want to point out that we've actually have now 2 additional handouts available, and these are the giveaways. And one of them is the ebook that Mike has graciously provided to everybody who has signed up and attended for this particular webcast. So you can now download that ebook as a PDF file. And there's also another, a second handout that was also just uploaded. It's now available so you can download, and that is the ebook from the Content Management Institute, and you can download that as well. I also want to thank WebAttract for their gracious offer on the discount and promotion. And I wanted to point out that, again, the code, the promotional code, and the link where you can use that code as you register for the online course that we talked about earlier today is available on the webcast summary handout, and that's available for download as well. And feel free to reach out to Mike. His contact information is on the handout. And if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to either Mike or myself. And I want to thank all of you for attending, and we hope to see you again a couple of weeks from now for the next upcoming webcast. And I want to point out that the upcoming webcasts are also in the slide deck, and the slide deck will be posted on SlideShare as always. You'll be provided a short URL where you can access the entire slide deck after today's discussion via email. And other than that, I want to thank Mike once again. Thank you for a great topic, a great discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hector, and let me also thank the audience again. Really enjoyed it.
Great. So I hope to see you again, same time, a couple of weeks from now, and see you again soon. Thank you very much.